What happens when one of the world's most controversial psychologists sits down with a late-night host who's never been afraid to throw punches? Tonight, we're diving into the explosive interview that had millions of viewers glued to their screens, watching two intellectual heavyweights go head-to-head in what started as a routine chat but quickly descended into television chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about celebrity interviews that go completely off the rails. The studio lights were blazing as Jimmy Kimmel settled into his chair, that familiar grin spreading across his face as he shuffled his note cards. The audience was buzzing with anticipation, many of them likely expecting the usual banter and promotional small talk that typically fills these late-night slots. But tonight was different. Tonight, Dr. Jordan Peterson was the guest, and anyone familiar with his reputation knew that conventional wisdom rarely applied when he was involved. "So, Dr. Peterson," Kimmel began, his tone light and conversational, "you've got a new book coming out, and I have to say, reading through some of your previous work, you certainly don't shy away from controversial topics. Tell us about this latest project." Peterson leaned forward slightly, his intense gaze fixed on Kimmel with that characteristic intensity that had made him both beloved and reviled across the globe. "Well, Jimmy, I think the real question isn't what the book contains, but whether people are genuinely ready to hear uncomfortable truths about the state of our society. The book explores the psychological underpinnings of personal responsibility and the dangerous trend toward ideological conformity that's sweeping through our institutions." Kimmel's eyebrows raised slightly, and you could almost see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't going to be the light promotional chat his producers had probably briefed him on. Uncomfortable truths. That's interesting. But don't you think that sometimes what people call uncomfortable truths are just, well, opinions that might not hold up under scrutiny? The temperature in the room seemed to shift perceptibly. Peterson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained measured. "Jimmy, with respect, that's precisely the kind of intellectual laziness that's contributing to the degradation of meaningful discourse. When we dismiss substantive arguments as mere opinions, we abdicate our responsibility to engage with ideas that challenge our preconceptions. Are you suggesting that empirical research and clinical observations should be dismissed simply because they make people uncomfortable?" Kimmel leaned back in his chair, clearly realizing he'd stepped into deeper waters than anticipated. The audience was quieter now, sensing the shift from entertainment to something more substantial. "I'm not dismissing anything, Dr. Peterson. I'm just saying that maybe, just maybe, when you make sweeping statements about society, people have a right to push back." "Push back with what exactly?" Peterson responded, his voice gaining an edge that regular viewers of his lectures would recognize. "With slogans? With emotional reactions? With character assassination? Because that's what I typically encounter. When people disagree with my work, very rarely do I see substantive engagement with the actual content." Kimmel's famous smile was starting to look a bit strained. "Come on now, that's not fair. There are plenty of smart people who disagree with your positions on gender pronouns, on hierarchies, on a lot of things. Are you saying they're all just being emotional?" "I'm saying," Peterson replied, his words carefully measured but loaded with conviction, "that when someone's primary response to an argument is to question the moral character of the person making it rather than addressing the substance of what's being said, that tells us something important about the intellectual climate we're operating in." The audience was completely silent now, watching this verbal chess match unfold. Kimmel glanced briefly at his cards, then back at Peterson. "But Dr. Peterson, don't you think there's a difference between intellectual discourse and just being provocative for the sake of being provocative? I mean, some of your statements, they seem designed to get a reaction." Peterson's laugh was short and sharp. "Jimmy, truth isn't designed to make people comfortable. If my statements provoke reactions, perhaps that says more about the fragility of the ideological frameworks people are operating within than it does about my intentions. I'm a clinical psychologist who spent decades treating people suffering from the consequences of unclear thinking and poorly structured lives. My observations come from that experience, not from a desire to be provocative. Okay, but let's talk specifics, Kimmel pressed, clearly feeling the need to regain some control of the conversation. You've made statements about enforced monogamy, about women in the workplace, about traditional gender roles. These aren't just abstract philosophical discussions for a lot of people. These are real issues affecting real lives. Peterson's eyes flashed with something that looked like controlled frustration. And there we have it. You've just demonstrated exactly what I was talking about. You've taken complex discussions about societal structures and psychological patterns and reduced them to inflammatory sound bites designed to paint me as some sort of regressive villain. Have you actually read the full context of those discussions, Jimmy, or are you working from the same misleading summaries that circulate on social media? The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I've read enough to know that your positions are controversial, and I think my audience deserves to hear you explain them. Your audience deserves to hear accurate representations of complex ideas, not gotcha journalism masquerading as intellectual curiosity, Peterson shot back. If you want to discuss enforced monogamy, let's talk about the anthropological and psychological research behind pair bonding and social stability. If you want to discuss gender roles, let's examine the biological and psychological literature on sex differences. But if you're just going to throw around politically charged phrases out of context, then we might as well be doing a Twitter debate. Kimmel's jaw tightened visibly. Dr. Peterson, I think you're being unfair. I'm trying to have a legitimate conversation here, but you seem to think that anyone who questions your ideas is either ignorant or malicious. Not at all, Peterson replied, leaning forward with renewed intensity. I welcome rigorous questioning. What I object to is lazy interrogation disguised as moral righteousness. You're not asking me to clarify or defend my positions, Jimmy. You're presenting strawman versions of my arguments and then challenging me to defend them. That's not intellectual. Honesty, that's intellectual theater. The studio audience could feel the electricity in the air as Kimmel's expression hardened. This wasn't going according to script, and everyone in the room knew it. The host straightened in his chair, his usual comedic demeanor replaced by something sharper, more combative. Intellectual theater? Kimmel repeated, his voice taking on a tone that regular viewers had rarely heard. Dr. Peterson, I've been doing this job for years. I know how to ask questions, and I know when someone is dodging them. You can dress up your evasions in academic language all you want, but at the end of the day, you've made statements that have real-world consequences. Peterson's response was immediate and cutting. Real-world consequences? Let's talk about real-world consequences, Jimmy. Let's talk about the young men who come to my lectures because they've been told by their universities, by their media, by their culture, that their very existence is problematic. Let's talk about the students who can't ask honest questions in their classrooms because they're afraid of being branded as bigots. Those are real-world consequences of the intellectual cowardice you're demonstrating right now. The audience was completely transfixed. This had moved far beyond entertainment into something raw and unfiltered. Kimmel's face was flushed now, his famous composure cracking. Intellectual cowardice? Are you serious right now? I'm sitting here trying to have an honest conversation with you, and you're attacking me personally because I won't just nod along with everything you say. You're not having an honest conversation, Peterson fired back, his voice rising slightly but maintaining that precise articulation that made every word feel like a surgical strike. You're performing moral superiority for your audience. There's a difference between challenging ideas and grandstanding, and right now, you're doing the latter. Kimmel slammed his cards down on the desk, the sharp sound echoing through the now silent studio. You know what, Dr. Peterson? Maybe the reason people push back against your ideas isn't because they're intellectually lazy or morally grandstanding. Maybe it's because your ideas are actually harmful. Maybe when you talk about hierarchies being natural and women being more agreeable, you're not sharing profound truths. You're just giving academic cover to prejudices that already exist. Peterson's laugh was cold and bitter. And there it is. The moral panic disguised as social justice. Jimmy, do you understand what you just did? You just suggested that acknowledging measurable psychological differences between men and women is equivalent to endorsing prejudice. You've conflated scientific observation with moral judgment. This is exactly the kind of thinking that's destroying intellectual honesty in our institutions. Scientific observation? Kimmel's voice was getting louder now, his composure completely abandoned. Is that what you call it when you suggest that women who wear makeup to work but complain about sexual harassment are being hypocritical? Is that what you call it when you imply that enforced monogamy might reduce violence against women? These aren't neutral scientific observations, Dr. Peterson. These are loaded political statements. Peterson stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of his movement. The audience gasped audibly. Stop right there, Jimmy. Just stop. You've just proven my point more effectively than I ever could have myself. You've taken two separate discussions, ripped them completely out of context, mashed them together into a grotesque caricature, and then demanded that I defend this fabrication of your own creation. Kimmel remained seated but leaned forward, aggressively. I'm quoting your own words, Dr. Peterson. No, you absolutely are not, Peterson shot back, his voice now carrying the full force of his academic authority. You're quoting selectively edited fragments designed to create maximum outrage while ignoring the broader context, the nuanced discussions, the careful qualifications, and the actual substance of what was being explored. This is precisely the kind of intellectual dishonesty that's poisoning public discourse. The host finally stood as well, the two men now facing each other across the small coffee table that suddenly seemed like a chasm. You want to talk about intellectual dishonesty? How about the intellectual dishonesty of building a career on telling people that traditional hierarchies are natural and inevitable while ignoring the systems of oppression that created and maintain those hierarchies? Peterson's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like rage, though his voice remained controlled. Jimmy, you just demonstrated that you understand absolutely nothing about what I've spent my career studying. Hierarchies exist across virtually all social species. They're not human inventions, they're biological realities. The question isn't whether they exist, it's how we structure them to minimize suffering and maximize meaning. But you can't even engage with that basic distinction because you're too invested in your ideological narrative. Ideological narrative? Kimmel's voice was approaching a shout now. My ideological narrative is that maybe, just maybe, we should question systems that have historically excluded and oppressed people instead of defending them as natural and inevitable. And my position, Peterson responded, his voice cutting through Kimmel's volume with surgical precision, is that blind rebellion against functional structures, without understanding their purpose or having viable alternatives, is a recipe for chaos and suffering. But you're not interested in that discussion because it requires nuance, and nuance doesn't serve your purposes here. The tension in the studio was palpable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles, sensing that they were capturing something unprecedented. Kimmel's producers were probably frantically calculating how much of this could actually air. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching two articulate men tear each other apart with words. My purposes, Kimmel demanded. What exactly do you think my purposes are, Dr. Peterson? Peterson's smile was sharp and unforgiving. Your purpose right now is to perform moral righteousness for your audience, by portraying me as a dangerous reactionary, so that you can feel good about yourself and they can feel good about agreeing with you. It's virtue signaling disguised as journalism, and it's exactly the kind of cheap intellectual theater that passes for discourse in our culture. That's enough, Kimmel said, his voice suddenly quiet but filled with venom. "You don't get to come on my show, insult my intelligence, attack my integrity, and then lecture me about discourse. You want to talk about intellectual theater? How about the intellectual theater of a man who built his reputation by refusing to use people's preferred pronouns and then spent years pretending it was about free speech instead of basic human decency?" The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between medieval knights. Peterson's face went completely still, his eyes fixed on Kimmel with an intensity that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "Jimmy, you just crossed a line that you don't even understand exists." The silence that followed Peterson's whispered threat was deafening. The studio had become a pressure cooker, and everyone present could feel that something was about to explode. Kimmel's face had gone pale, but his jaw was set with determination. He wasn't backing down now. "What line, Dr. Peterson?" Kimmel asked, his voice steady despite the tension crackling between them. "The line where I point out that your entire public persona is built on manufactured controversy? The line where I suggest that maybe your concerns about free speech are less about principle and more about preserving your right to make other people uncomfortable?" Peterson took a step closer to the desk, his tall frame casting a shadow across Kimmel's space. "The line where you reduce a complex legal and philosophical position to a cartoon villain narrative because it's easier than actually engaging with the substance of what was at stake. You want to talk about basic human decency. Jimmy, let's talk about the basic human decency of not forcing people to participate in compelled speech under threat of legal sanctions." "Compelled speech?" Kimmel's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You mean using someone's preferred pronouns? That's what you're calling compelled speech? Using basic courtesy and respect when talking to another human being?" Peterson's voice dropped, even lower, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Jimmy, if you can't understand the difference between choosing to be courteous and being legally compelled to use specific language under threat of punishment, then you don't understand the first thing about freedom of expression or the precedent that was being set." "Freedom of expression," Kimmel repeated mockingly. "Right. The freedom to express disrespect for people who are already marginalized. The freedom to hide behind academic language while promoting ideas that hurt real people in real ways." "Hurt real people?" Peterson's composure finally cracked completely. "Do you want to know what hurts real people, Jimmy? The ideological capture of our educational institutions, the destruction of merit-based evaluation, the teaching of children that they're inherently oppressive or inherently oppressed based on characteristics they can't control, the promotion of victimhood as identity and resentment as virtue. That's what's hurting real people." Kimmel stepped around his desk now, closing the distance between them. "And there it is, the real Jordan Peterson. Forget all the intellectual posturing, forget all the academic credentials. At the end of the day, you're just another privileged man who's angry that the world is changing, and you don't get to be the default anymore." The words hit Peterson like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and for a moment it looked like he might actually lose complete control. When he spoke, his voice was shaking with barely contained fury. "Privileged? You want to talk about privilege, Jimmy? I grew up in a small town in northern Alberta. My father was a school teacher. I worked construction jobs to pay for university. I spent decades treating people who were genuinely suffering, people who had been broken by life and needed help putting themselves back together. What's your background, Jimmy? What have you built, besides a career making jokes about people from behind a desk? At least I'm not making a living telling young men that their problems are everyone else's fault," Kimmel shot back. "At least I'm not building a movement based on resentment and blame." Peterson's laugh was savage. "Resentment and blame? Jimmy, I spend my time trying to get people to take responsibility for their own lives. I tell them to clean up their own problems before trying to fix the world. You spend your time making entertainment out of other people's failures and calling it social commentary. That's rich coming from someone who became famous by picking fights with college students and transgender people, Kimmel snarled. You built your entire brand on punching down and then crying about free speech when people called you out for it. Something in Peterson's expression shifted, becoming almost predatory. Jimmy, you just revealed something very important about yourself. You think that engaging in substantive disagreement with people you happen to sympathize with constitutes punching down. You've just admitted that you don't see these individuals as capable of defending their own positions. You've infantilized them while claiming to protect them. Kimmel's face went white with rage. Don't you dare try to turn this around on me. Don't you dare suggest that I'm the one being condescending when you've spent years building a career on intellectual bullying. Intellectual bullying? Peterson's voice was deadly quiet now. Is that what you call it when someone expects you to defend your positions with logic and evidence instead of emotional appeals and moral posturing? Is that what you call it when someone refuses to pretend that bad arguments are good just because they serve a cause you happen to support? I call it intellectual bullying when someone uses their platform to attack vulnerable people while hiding behind claims of objectivity and truth, Kimmel responded, his voice rising again. I call it intellectual bullying when someone builds their reputation by making marginalized communities feel unsafe and unwelcome. Peterson stepped even closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Jimmy, you just said something that reveals the fundamental corruption of your entire worldview. You believe that ideas should be evaluated based on whether they make certain people feel safe and welcome, rather than whether they're true. You've just admitted that you're willing to sacrifice intellectual honesty for emotional comfort. And you've just admitted that you care more about being right than about being decent, Kimmel fired back. The studio had become completely silent except for the two men's voices. Camera operators were still rolling, capturing every word of this unprecedented meltdown. Security personnel had moved closer to the stage, clearly unsure about whether they needed to intervene. Peterson's smile was cold and final. Jimmy, there's something you need to understand. Decency without truth is just empty sentimentalism, and truth without courage is just cowardice. You've spent this entire interview demonstrating both. Get out, Kimmel said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Just get out. I'm done with this. Security, please escort Dr. Peterson off the stage. Peterson didn't move. He stood there for a long moment, looking at Kimmel with something that might have been pity. Jimmy, this has been the most honest conversation you've probably had on this show in years. The only difference is that, for once, your guest refused to play along with the theater. Security now, Kimmel repeated, his voice shaking with rage. As the security guards approached, Peterson straightened his jacket and looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something very important. You've seen what happens when someone refuses to submit to ideological conformity, disguised as moral righteousness. Remember this moment, because this is how intellectual freedom dies. Not with jackboots and book burnings, but with social pressure and moral panic masquerading as virtue. The security guards reached Peterson, but he was already walking toward the exit on his own. He paused at the edge of the stage and looked back at Kimmel one final time. Jimmy, I genuinely hope that someday you develop the courage to have the conversations that actually matter instead of just the ones that make you feel good about yourself. As Peterson disappeared into the wings, Kimmel stood alone on the stage, his chest heaving, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and something that might have been shame. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply process what they had just witnessed. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Kimmel's attempt to regain his composure, before finally cutting to commercial. But everyone in that studio knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. a collision between two worldviews so fundamentally different that no amount of civil discourse could bridge the gap. What started as a routine book promotion had become a masterclass in how deep philosophical differences can explode into personal warfare when the stakes feel existential. Two articulate, intelligent men had torn each other apart with words, each convinced that the other represented everything wrong with modern discourse. And somewhere in that brutal exchange, millions of viewers had gotten a glimpse of the intellectual civil war tearing through our culture, where every conversation is a battle and every disagreement is treated as an act of war. So what do you think? Was Peterson right that Kimmel was engaging in intellectual theater? Or was Kimmel justified in calling out what he saw as harmful ideas dressed up in academic language? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the conversations that reveal who we really are as a society.